Welcome back for part two of our conversation. You're watching the Real News Network. I'm Kim Brown. We're joined with Dimitri Lascaris and Earl Washburn. They conducted a survey amongst Canadians, a survey entitled Canadians' Views of the Israeli Government versus Canadian Government Policy Towards Israel and Palestine. And they found some very interesting way about Canadians' views towards this issue. So, Dimitri, let me ask you, why was it important to ask people whether they thought criticism of Israel was anti-Semitic, and what were the results that you found?
So, it is very difficult in Canada. Certainly, Canada is not the only Western country where this is the case. It's very difficult to have a candid discussion about violation of Palestinian rights by the government of Israel, no matter how severe those violations may be, no matter how long-standing. And the reason is quite simply because just about anybody who tries to have that conversation in a candid way with reference to the facts and the realities of international law is branded by a small but very vocal group of apologists for the government of Israel. For example, an organization called the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, another organization called B'nai B'rith Canada, and there are a few others. They're immediately branded as being anti-Semitic and racist, and nobody likes to have that such a serious and terrible accusation hurled against them, and so people are quite reluctant to have this conversation. And so it was necessary, we thought, in order to test public opinion on that issue. Does the public actually agree that criticism of the Israeli government is necessarily anti-Semitic? And clearly, virtually no one in this country actually believes that. Even as 80% of the supporters of the right-wing conservative government do not accept the proposition that criticism of the Israeli government is anti-Semitic. And I think that this finding should embolden people to have the conversation that really needs to be had about the violations of Palestinian human rights. The Canadian government, is very complicit and has been for a long time in those violations. It supports the government of Israel economically, militarily, politically. Canadian Prime Minister Leston B. Pearson played a key role. He's viewed as being a human rights champion, surprisingly, within Canada. He actually played a key role in the unjust partition of Palestine, as did a former Canadian Supreme Court justice named Ivan Rand. And, from that very moment, we've been promoting the Zionist project of the creation of a Jewish state to the disadvantage of the indigenous Palestinian population in that part of the world. And we have an obligation, a heavy burden, because of the complicity of the Canadian government in the suffering of the Palestinian people, to speak out and to have that conversation. And so I'm very encouraged by the fact that the Canadian public just isn't buying it. They aren't buying the claim that those who criticize the state of Israel are anti-Semitic.
So how much has media coverage of Israel-Palestine changed over the past few decades, in your opinion, or has it not really changed in Canada?
Well, I haven't seen much of a change until very recently. The narrative that it predominates here, even to this day, and certainly has predominated for decades, is that Israel is the Middle East's only democracy, even though it effectively disenfranchises a very substantial portion of the population based on its ethnicity, that Israel is surrounded by enemies and is confronting on a daily basis an existential threat, even though the government, the dictator of Egypt, Sisi, and his predecessors were at peace with Israel and essentially do as Israel likes in terms of regulating the border of Gaza, even though Jordan is at peace with Israel, even though Syria is such a mess that it couldn't possibly pose a significant threat to the very powerful Israeli military. Lebanon's military, including even Hezbollah, don't have anywhere near the kind of firepower that the Israeli military has. Israel is the only nuclear state in the entire Middle East. By virtue of that alone, it is much better equipped to defend itself than any other state in the Middle East. But the narrative here is that Israel is threatened. Israel is, being on the verge of being wiped out, and we must do everything possible to protect the Middle East's only democracy. That's the narrative. Now, I indicated at the outset there's been a change. There have been surprisingly some quite critical articles appearing in the mainstream press over the last 2 to 3 months about Israel's human rights record. There was a piece in the Globe and Mail by a well-known journalist named Jared Kaplan, in which he essentially compared or suggested that Israel may actually be an apartheid state or on the verge of becoming an apartheid state. There was a similar piece in the Toronto Star, another mainstream media organization that has a very wide readership. Again, there was, a suggestion that Israel may actually be an apartheid state. This is remarkable for these types of sentiments to be reflected in the mainstream media here. And I think that the reason is that it's no longer become even remotely plausible that the Israeli government is interested in a just peace, because it is not only, confiscating illegally huge swaths of the best land in the West Bank, and it only has annexed, East Jerusalem illegally, but there are people now within the Israeli government, like the education minister Naftali Bennett, who openly declare that the two-state solution is dead. They don't want the Palestinians to have any state. They're not even being, subtle about it any longer. It's just an open statement that the government, key members of the government routinely make. And all the while, the suffering of the Palestinian people, for example, and particularly in Gaza, which the UN says is on the verge of becoming uninhabitable. There are 1.8 million people trapped in that enclave. It's on the verge of becoming uninhabitable. It's now become so obvious to the public and to the media and to the political elites of this country that the government of Israel has no interest in a just peace, that they can't with a straight face continue that narrative any longer. And I think that that's why we're starting to see this change in the tone and the substance of the reporting in the mainstream media.
And speaking of that, the mainstream has been sort of changing over the last 25 years. Mainstream Israeli society has become more overtly right-wing, chauvinistic, and jingoistic. So how much of a shift in Canadian attitudes towards Israel-Palestine do you ascribe to the changes within Israel itself? And how much do you think is down to the people simply learning more about the reality of what has been happening over there?
Well, I think the part, there is absolutely an overtly racist tone to the discourse in the Israeli government now. For example, the justice minister shockingly posted something on her Facebook page not too long ago, which described Palestinian children as little snakes. The education minister, Naftali Bennett, whom I just mentioned, openly boasted once about how many Arabs he's killed. The deputy defense minister of Israel, the one who was appointed in 2013, stated, and this is reported widely in the Israeli press, that Palestinians are not human, that they're basically like animals. Those were the words that he used. That language, which is astonishing, it's astonishing that any Western government purporting to be a human rights champion and a democracy would support a government whose ministers make those kinds of statements. That language has not yet appeared in the mainstream press here. What is appearing is, talk about the settlement regulation law, which, as I say, it seeks to legalize these illegal settlements. The statements to the effect that the two-state solution is dead, that's getting into the press. But people are nonetheless finding out more and more about the overtly racist elements within the Israeli government through the independent media. I think that's where they're getting that information. And they're relying less and less on organizations like Post Media, the largest newspaper publisher in Canada, which cannot bring itself to say a negative thing about the state of Israel, no matter how bad its conduct may be.
So, Earl, let's switch back to the methodology of this survey for a moment. I'm curious, what effect do you think that the fact that this survey was conducted online rather than by telephone or in person would have? So in other words, are there older demographics that may not have seen, or rather may not have been as involved in this poll?
Sure, certainly, as I mentioned, there's 10 to 20% of the population that still are not connected online. So for this particular survey, we weren't able to go out to people via phone. So yeah, they weren't included in this survey. So there are certain demographics, of course, that are less likely to be online. Certainly older demographics, lower educated people for sure. I feel very confident, though, based on our weighting techniques, that we were able to account for that. As I mentioned, we weighted by education. And for a survey particularly like this, I felt that education was very important to take a look at. And we did see that there was a lot of difference in education. The more higher educated you were, the more likely you were to be more skeptical of the Israeli side of things. So definitely education played a strong part in the breakdown of this. And I hope that by weighting the data based on the educational portions of the country, we were able to have the data come out to something that closely mirrors the Canadian public.
Indeed. Well, the results of your survey has certainly been very revealing about Canadians' attitudes and shifting attitudes towards Israel-Palestine. We have been speaking with Earl Washburn. Earl is a senior analyst at Ecos Research Associates, and he also played a crucial role in guiding and designing and analyzing the survey behind this report. You've also been joined with Dimitri Lascaris, who is a lawyer, journalist, and activist, also a board member here at The Real News. And if you're interested in the results of this survey, we have a link to it available right underneath this interview. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us and sharing the results of your findings.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kim.
And thank you for watching The Real News Network.